Tonight's hymn story is Rock of Ages. Do you know what page that is? 451? 451. I was telling, I think last week, there's been a couple of, been several days here of songs that I don't know, that I'm not familiar with, so I've had to kind of go back. In April, there were several that I skipped over because I just couldn't get to all of them, but I thought I'd go back and look at Rock of Ages. When you read these stories, you just find things out that you never would have imagined. And you're going to see that tonight on this story. So he says this is based off of 1 Corinthians 10, 1, 3, and 4, where it talks about they all ate of that same spiritual food and drank of the same spiritual drink. They drank from that spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. So the writer here says, this fervent plea for Christ, our eternal rock, to grant salvation through his sacrifice and to be a place of refuge for the believer, is one of the most popular hymns ever written, with strong emotional impact. It proclaims Christ's atonement on the cross to be the only means of salvation, making man's tears and efforts to justify himself of no avail. Also, it urges us to find consolation and security in Christ our rock, even at the time of death. Augustus Toplady's strong and passionate lines were actually written to refute some teachings of John and Charles Wesley. Now, I never knew that. Evidently, they had a bitter controversy concerning Arminianism, which stresses man's free will, versus John Calvin's doctrine of election. So this hymn was written as a refutal of Arminianism, which basically Arminianism says you can lose your salvation, or you can lay it down or whatever. So he goes on to say, Rock of Ages was the climax to an article that Toplady wrote in the Gospel magazine in 1776. That seems like an important year, 1776. In which he supported the doctrine of election by arguing that just as England could never pay her national debt, so man, through his own effort, could never satisfy the eternal justice of a holy God. Despite the belligerent intent of this text, God preserved this hymn for more than 200 years to bring blessing to both Arminian and Calvinistic believers around the world. And just to say on the Arminian Calvinism thing, it's a spectrum. If you go all the way to the left in Arminian, all the way to the right of Calvinism, there's all kinds of beliefs in between those. But I just, I never knew that about this song. I thought that was interesting. So, at the age of 16, Augustus Toplady sat in a barn and listened to the preaching of an uneducated man. He was dramatically converted. Later, he became a powerful and a respected minister of the Anglican Church. While he was the busy pastor of several churches in England, he wrote many hymns, but few have survived. Rock of Ages is the one for which he is known today. So there you have it. Rock of Ages was written to refute Arminianism. I thought that was very interesting. It's on page 451. Let me read you. I'll read you the poem I have here in the book. It's not exactly the same as the one in our hymn, but it's rock. Verse 1 is Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy wounded side which flowed be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. Could my tears forever flow? Could my zeal no longer know? These for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone. In my hand no price I bring. Simply to the cross I cling. While I draw this fleeting breath, when my eyes shall close in death, when I rise to worlds unknown, and behold thee on thy throne, Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. Beautiful old hymn. It's on page 451. 451. We'll sing the first and last verse. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy riven side which flow be of sin the double cure. Save from wrath and make me pure, while I draw this fleeting breath. When my eyes shall close in death, when I soar to worlds unknown, see thee on thy judgment throne. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Amen. Thank you, Karen. Appreciate that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter number 11. And Dennis, you may have to check and see if this. Oh, there's Gummy. Montgomery, see if this thing's on, will you? It should be on the very.
Text test.
It's on. So this is the second part of.
Test.
It should be. What is this called? No. Wireless. No. What's it? Lapel. That's what it is. Lapel. That's a French word. It means it hangs on your shirt. All righty. I'm going to turn this one off. Okay. So 2 Samuel chapter 11. Sad story as we look at this. I woke up this morning and, I've told you before, I'm a creature of habit. If anybody ever wants to kill me, they're going to be able to figure it out because I do the same thing every day, at least for the first part of the day. But I did my walk and prayed and all that, and then I came home and I sat down and finished reading my yearly Bible reading. But then I started studying this, and just all kinds of thoughts came to me about, how this is a picture, how this pictures sin's power. Just how powerful sin can overwhelm a person. And to the point, where people murder one another, right? And in this instance, he committed adultery and then ended up killing, But I just thought, how powerful sin is in that it can consume a person who, David's not some raving maniac. He's a man after God's own heart. And yet he falls into a really, really, just makes a really, really bad choice. And I wrote down, last week, I started off with the sin's plan. And I didn't read you those verses. Probably good if I did. Y'all can stay there in that. But back in James, it tells us, kind of how sin ends. And it's in chapter 1 of James. But it says, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempts he any man. But every man's tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And then when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. I was thinking about David and Bathsheba today, and I was thinking about after they had this, little tryst that they had. I know that David felt guilty. There's no way he couldn't have. If he's a child of God, he's going to feel shame and guilt. And that's all of that's the product of sin. It robs you of your peace, and it destroys people's life. Just think about Bathsheba walking back over to her house that night. She had to have felt horrible, knowing that she had just betrayed her husband. I was reading in, I think I might have mentioned this. I've got Swindoll's commentary. It's called A Man of Passion and Destiny, and it's about the life of David. But he has a section in here where he talks about how the devil never wants you to know how sin's going to end. And he writes here, it's been my observation over the years, the devil never tips his hand in temptation. He shows you the beauty and the ecstasy and the fun and the excitement and the stimulating adventure of stolen desires, but he never tells the heavy drinker, tomorrow morning there's going to be a hangover. Ultimately, you're going to ruin your family. He never tells the drug user, this is the beginning of a long, sorrowful, dead-end road. He never tells the thief, you're going to get caught, friend. You do this, and you're going to wind up behind bars. He certainly doesn't warn the adulterer. You know, pregnancy is a real possibility, or you might get a life-threatening disease. Are you kidding? Face it. When the sin is done and all the penalties of the sin come due, the devil's nowhere to be found. He smiles as you fall, but he leaves you with no encouragement when the consequences kick in. How the mighty have fallen. F.B. Meyer said, one brief spell of passionate, indulgent, and then his character blasted irretrievably, his peace vanished, the foundation of his kingdom imperiled, the Lord displeased, and great occasion given to his enemies to blaspheme. He goes on to say, and lest you think David's fall was sudden, consider this Emily Dickinson's poem. Crumbling is not an instant's act, a fundamental pause. Dilapidation's processes are organized decays. 'Tis first a cobweb on the soul, a cuticle of dust, a bore in the axis, an element of rust. Ruin is formal, devil's work, consecutive and slow. Fail in an instant, no man did. Slipping is crash's law. So there you have it. Well, anyway, I could give you all kinds of stuff on that, and we're going to read it, but I wrote this morning just when I was studying, I wrote down, sin's power, sin's presence is everywhere. Here's David in the palace. Nothing kind of inoculates us or insulates us from that. It's like the old guy I've told you before. He said he didn't want anybody to know what he was, how he was living or whatever. So he retrieved to his own house, and then he realized that the people in his house could see him. So he retreated to his bedroom, and he said, even there, my wife could see me. And then he said, I retreated to the halls of my mind. And he said, even there I found God was there watching me. Sin's present everywhere. The picture that we get of sin is that it is very harmful and powerful. I love watching those true crime things, which is probably not a good thing, but I don't know how many times I've heard, DAs say something like this, what a waste. What a waste. What a waste of a life. Somebody's killed over $25 or something. They're like, just what a waste. Sin, it's not just harmful and powerful, but it's just like a waste. It just wastes, that part of you that shouldn't be wasted. I mentioned this last week, sin is progressive, and David's sin progresses, and then the product of sin. Well, let's read, and then we'll go over the another outline. So, verse 1 of 2 Samuel 11. It came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servant with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. I did think about this today as I was studying this. Last week, and many people mentioned that, Bathsheba, she should have been more careful. And she should have been. But it's possible that she was thinking, David's not home because he's out to war. Or at least he's supposed to be. But then he wasn't. And then verse 3, and let's see. So he saw a woman washing herself. The woman was very beautiful to look on. Verse 3, and David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. So that was it. They had sex, and he just sent her home. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. Sin always has consequences. And in this situation, it was a child. In verse 6, and David sent to Joab, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. David was not one bit interested in any of that. He didn't care about any of that. David had one thing in mind. Verse 8, David said to Uriah, go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. The king sent down to his house a big, lavish, a dinner, a nice dinner for him and Bathsheba. Verse 9, but Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his Lord, and went not down to his house. So David, is trying to cover up. He's trying to cover his sin. And the providential thing about it is, God's not going to let that happen. It's like David's beating his head against the wall. It's just not going to work. Uriah is more honorable than David. So Uriah, he won't go down and sleep with his wife. And then verse 10, and when they told David, saying, Uriah went not down into his house, David said unto Uriah, camest thou not from thy journey? Why then didst not go down into thy house? And Uriah said unto David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go into my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. Can you imagine how David felt when he heard that? He's like, this is going to be harder than I thought. I can't imagine the conviction David was under. That had to have convicted him. Well, anyway, so that's what Uriah says. So that's David's first attempt to cover the sin. Send him down. Hopefully he'll sleep with his wife, and that way if she comes up pregnant, he'll never know that it's not his. And then verse 12, David said to Uriah, tarry here today also and tomorrow, and I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And he even went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his house. So David's second scheme is to get him drunk and then send him home. And hopefully in his drunkenness, that he will give into that passion. Matthew Henry said, Uriah was more of an honorable man drunk than David was sober. I bet that hurt. Well, anyway, so he didn't go down to his house. Verse 14, and it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the battle, hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but one of my points is, and I'll go over these points with you, but one of my points is the cruelty of sin. I mean, you can't get much more cruel than that. Sending the guy's death warrant by his own hand because he knows he's honorable. He's not going to read it. But, guys and ladies, lest we think that is, something horrible, and it is horrible what David did. But you think about the person who betrays his husband or her husband or, his wife. Or the person who goes out and gets drunk and doesn't think of the consequences of his family. That's cruel stuff. I told you I counseled a couple one time. The wife came in, and she said, my husband, and if you'd have looked at this couple, you'd have never known anything was wrong with their life. She said, my husband's addicted to heroin, and he's taking the paycheck every week and blowing it on drugs, and we're starving to death. I'm like, how can that be? And I brought the guy in and was counseling with him, and heroin is a difficult thing for people to break. But he fessed up to it, but he didn't. At least while I was counseling with him, he didn't get over it. Think about the cruelty of that. Sin, we don't think of it this way, but sin is so cruel. When a man or a woman does a sin that impacts their family or their relationships, it's cruel to that person that it's impacting. And we don't think that way. And the reason we don't think that way is because we're so selfish and sinful. I just can't imagine just how cruel this is. Well, he's going to find out. You remember, the Lord's going to send a prophet to him and explain how cruel it is. But anyway, let's keep going. And so verse 16, it came to pass when Joab observed the city that he assigned Uriah into a place where he knew that valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. I've been reading, trying to stay up with my daily Bible reading, and I'm over in Kings now. At the end of David's life, he gives a chronicle of a list of his mighty men. You know who's the last person on his list of mighty men? Uriah the Hittite, which I find interesting. He has all these mighty men listed, and the very last one's Uriah. Well, verse 18, then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. And he charged the messenger, saying, when thou hast made an end of telling the matter of the war unto the king, and if so be that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, wherefore approached you so nigh unto the city when you did fight? Knew you not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast a piece of a millstone upon him from the wall, that he died in Thebez? Why went you nigh the wall? Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So Joab says, go tell him this news, and if he says, why in the world did you get so close to the wall? Just tell him, oh yeah, Uriah got killed also. And he said, once he hears that, he's going to be fine. And if you study this out a little bit, if you dig a little bit deeper into what's going on here, Joab had to know what was going on. Joab was a man of the world. He put two and two together, and he's realizing David has done something to this guy's family. And, most people believe Joab understood it, and that he could hold that over David's head later, kind of as a bargaining chip. But anyway, verse 22. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him for. And the messenger said unto David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out unto us in the field, and we were upon them even unto the entering of the gate, and the shooters shot from off the wall and upon thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead. I want you to notice that. Some of the king's servants be dead. Uriah was not the only casualty. This little ruse that David put in place didn't just impact Uriah. It impacted some other servants of God, some valiant men that stormed the walls. So really, David was responsible for the death of multiple men here, not just Uriah. And he had to live with that on his conscience. So some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Now I want you to look at the callousness of sin. Look what verse 25 says. Then David said unto the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devours one as well as the other. Oh well, no big deal.
Hey, don't be discouraged, Joab. It's okay. The sword kills one guy as good as it does the other. Guys and ladies, that's the guy who wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's what sin does. Sin can transform the godly into the unwicked godly, the most ungodly you can imagine. And we still don't get the full, warning of it. It's unbelievable. So he says, make the battle more strong against the city and overthrow it. Encourage thou him. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Yeah. So, guys and ladies, let me just give you, I'll go back a little bit of this, and I'll just give you the points of this, and we'll try to get down to chapter 12. So, last week we talked about this. It was the kind of sin. And the kind of sin that he had was lust. It was a sensual desire. And as I read over this more and more, I like what Swindoll says about this, but and I think this guy that I'm reading here took from Swindoll's commentary, but look what he says this. David had a problem with lust. It appears that David had a strong sexual desire and sought to satisfy his urges by accumulating women. But David, like many others, discovered that many sexual partners will not satisfy sexual desires. It only increases them. David should have figured that out. So he had a problem with lust. And I like what this guy says. David had a problem with a spiritual giant named lust. You may not battle that one, but you know the name of the one that you do battle. And he goes on to say it's good to identify it so it can be defeated. The second thing we talked about last week was the conditions of sin. I didn't read this to you, but I'm going to read it to you tonight. So what was the environment that caused David to sin? And I told you last week there are some conditions where sins come more easily. It just happens more. And I told you when you're tired physically or spiritually or emotionally, when you're relaxed morally, spiritually or emotionally, and when you're in unfamiliar territory. Those environments can breed an easier time for you to give in, which is unfortunate. But somebody else wrote these 6 things, and I want to read them to you. So here was the environment that David was in. He neglected his duty. So he stayed at home, and we talked about that last week. He stayed at home instead of going out and fighting. Secondly, he had idle time on his hands. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. Isn't it interesting the things you can come up with an idle mind? Thirdly, he says success. David enjoyed absolute success and victory over all of his enemies. But you're never more vulnerable than when you have just enjoyed a great success. People develop a feeling of invincibility. I was going to mention that last week. A lot of times after a great victory, people fall. And David had a series of victories. And if you think about that, you think about Elijah. When Elijah defeated those prophets of Baal, and then he runs from the lady. Who's the lady? Jezebel. Number 4, he writes, so there was neglect of duty, idle time, success. Number 4, pride. David knew that God was with him. He may have let that knowledge go to his head. He may have forgotten the truth that God will walk with those who are going his way. Amos 3:3. Anyway, and he goes on, number 5 is arrogance. David had come to believe his own press. He believed he was everything people said he was. I remember reading a story. I think it might have been Theodore Roosevelt that had a very close aide. And he told President Roosevelt, he said, now listen, Mr. President, people are going to say a lot of great things about you, and the paper's going to write a lot of amazing stories about how great you are. He said, but just don't forget, you and I know different. He said, don't ever forget that. You know, I've often thought about that. You know, his buddy was saying, but I really know who you are, so don't you get the big head. Well, maybe David did get a big head. I don't know. And number 6, this guy, and I think this may be something we have, at least I've overlooked in studying this. It seems that David, at this point, had neglected the spiritual man. We can only speculate, he writes, but it seems that David was guilty of neglecting his spiritual health. People who stay close to the Lord through prayer and reading and meditating on His Word don't do what David did. Now, people can do that. But I'll tell you, if you're in a closer relationship with God, it is harder to give into those things. So anyway, we talked about the condition and the kind. And then number 3, we said the course of sin. And what was the course? It's found in verse number 2 of chapter 11. It says, in eventide, David arose from off his bed, walked upon the roof at the king's house, and he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon, and he sent and inquired after the woman. And then verse 4, and David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her. So what was the course? He looked, he longed, he lingered, he lusted, and he lost the battle. That was that. Then we talked last week about the conflict of sin. In verse number 3, he asked, who is this woman? And his servant said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And again, I'm not trying to preach over this exact the same thing, but the fact is, every time we do sin in that manner, there's always a conflict. You're making a decision contrary to what the Spirit of God's telling you. And we know David was under conflict. If you don't believe that, read Psalm 51, because that's his confession after he has sinned with Bathsheba. And then number 4, we talked about the commission of sin. He sent for her, he took her, he had her, and then he was finished with her. And here's where we left off. We didn't get into last week, and this is verse number 5. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. So David begins this plan to cover up his sin. Again, I like what Swindoll wrote about this part. And not, I don't always agree with everything Swindoll writes, but listen to what he said. When David got the news that she was pregnant, he had 2 courses. He could go before God and declare himself completely contaminated, sinful, guilty, and then declare to his country and the nation, I have sinned. Obviously, that was exactly what he should have done. Or he could go the route of deception and hypocrisy. Sadly, David chose the latter, which led him even further into sin, including the horrific act of murder. And let's not forget, his choosing to lie and deceive set in motion an endless series of heartaches within his immediate family in the years to come. What a fool he was to try and cover up his sin. Well, he does try to cover it up. And I would just remind you guys and ladies, flip over to Proverbs 28. So split your Bible in half, go to Proverbs, and look in chapter 28 and verse 13. I've read this to you before. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. David was trying to cover his sins. Self-preservation. It reminds me kind of like the story of Michael English. And if you've never read his biography, he was a great Southern gospel singer. He had just received several of the highest awards you can receive in the Southern Gospel Association, the Dove Awards. The very next day, a lady that he had been committing adultery with told him she was pregnant. And he had to decide what to do. Anyway, his wife finds out, they get divorced. It comes out that he has done this with this lady. He gives all of those dove awards back. Everybody shuns him. And it's just interesting. The lady that he was having this adulterous affair with, she lost the baby. So in the end, there wasn't a baby. And that one event in his life sunk him for years. And he went through a cycle of addiction. And he never came back to where he was. It's just sad. Anyway, the consequence of sin is horrible. So anyway, David tries to cover his sin. So let's read it again quickly. Verse 7 and verse 6, David sent to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So he sends him to David. Verse 7, Uriah comes home and he asked about the war. David says, go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah doesn't do it. So that's the first attempt. And then verses 11, he tells Uriah, says to David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and that's his explanation. Then verse 12, David said to Uriah, tarry here today and tomorrow, and I'll let you go. And verse 13, and when David had called him, he did eat and drink for him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie with his bed with the servants, and he went down not to his house. So the second attempt didn't work. And then the next morning, here's the third attempt, and it came to pass in the morning, David wrote the letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And we just read it, that he takes the letter. Verse 17, the men of the city went out, fought with Joab. There fell some of the people of the servants, and Uriah the Hittite died also. So in David's covering the sin, it didn't work. I watched one of those true crime things the other day. A young man butchered two ladies in the Portland area or Seattle area when he was 21, and he got away with that for 40 years. 40 years. And they tracked him down through some DNA and other that. He had covered that for 40 years. And it's interesting, the guy who was interviewing the family said, he basically got away with murder. And the lady was like, well, yeah, kind of, but he didn't really, because he got caught. Isn't it interesting how God has a way of, sometimes our sins aren't exposed to the public. But I'll tell you what, they're never covered in God's eyes. And that's why there's always those consequences. So his covering didn't work. And then verses 16 through 25, we see the callousness of sending the letter. And then go to verse 26. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. Now let me ask you a question. Did David have to do that? No. Even in the midst of that callousness, David, there's a continuation in this sin. He continues this horrible progression. Not only has he's ruined and wrecked and robbed this family, now he's continuing something that wasn't right. And and you know the story here. Her baby dies. The baby doesn't live. And so anyway, David, and y'all know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but the next chapter, David's going to be confronted. And David's going to go, wow, yeah, you're right. Well, the continuation of the sin, in my opinion, was not a good thing. But then there's the last thing of verse 27. And when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house. She became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. My last part or point on this, before we get to chapter 12, is the condemnation of sin. I remember a guy telling me one time, if you ever think that your sin is not disgusting to God, just think about Christ on the cross. Because it's our sin is what put him on that cross. And sometimes we think our sins are just little and they're not that big of a deal, but it's sin that put Christ on the cross. And David here is not going to get away with that. I mean, God is going to condemn him. And again, Psalm 32 and Psalm 51 are the David's heart when he's going through this. And it's not good. It's not a good thing. I want to leave you with 3 thoughts, okay? And that is, number 1, and these are just things I wrote about sin. Our flesh is weak. Doesn't matter who you are. The Bible tells us the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So whoever we are, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we've accomplished in the past. Our flesh is weak. If we're put in the right environment at the right time under the right circumstance, we could do things that we would be ashamed of and possibly not even really survive as the family or whatever. So I think it's good for us to remember, take heed. We're weak. We're weak beings, and that's why the Bible says, I can do all things through Christ, but I can't do everything without Christ. The second thing is that sin's consequences are horrible. And I know I've already mentioned that. And we haven't gotten into all this yet, but if you just think about what's happened so far, David has destroyed a family. He's destroyed his testimony. He's wrecked Bathsheba's life, all because of a little sexual tryst that he wanted to have. The consequences of sin are horrible. And the last thing, so our flesh is weak, the consequences, and the last thing is this: sin doesn't ever give up on you. As in, it continually tries to wreck you. I want you to think about this, guys and ladies. You know, I want you to go to Galatians chapter 5. I want to show you something. And I was thinking about this earlier today and how it applies in this situation. But in Galatians 5, we have this principle that we really ought to grab hold of. In Galatians 5, verse 17, it says, "For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary one to the other, so you cannot do the things that you would." Now, don't think that I'm crazy, okay? But really, we're like two beings. We have a spiritual side of us, and we have this fleshly side of us. And this fleshly side of us, guys and ladies, it never accepts the spiritual side. Never. Don't ever forget that. Your fleshly side never wants to make peace with your spiritual side. Never. Your fleshly side wants to be in control and command and wants to do everything it can to feed its flesh. That's why those desires never go away. But as I was thinking about this morning, I just thought, you know, guys and ladies, the biggest enemy you have, it's not your husband, it's not the devil, it's you. You're your biggest enemy. You've got to learn that part of your flesh wants to destroy your spiritual life. It doesn't want you to go to church, doesn't want you to read the Bible, doesn't want you to pray, doesn't want you to witness, doesn't want you to be what God wants you to be. It wants to be in control and in charge, and it wants to live a life that is completely anti-God. It wants to watch what it wants to watch and do what it wants to do and say what it wants to say and be what it wants to be, and it doesn't want the Spirit of God telling it can't do that. I'm telling you, listen, we need to figure out that as a believer, we're like a dichotomy. We have this spiritual side that is trying to help us go in the right direction, and we have this fleshly side that is constantly trying to pull us back, hold us back, keep us back from doing what God wants us to do. And poor old David, I guess, didn't get that. Because there was a fleshly side of him that said, you know what? I get you love reading the Word and all that stuff, but I'm going to fulfill my desire. And ladies and gentlemen, listen to me, that is the battle you are faced with every day. When you want to spout off your temper, you want to gossip about somebody, you want to give into a sexual, sensual desire, that is the battle that you're faced with. And the Spirit of God is greater than our flesh and is able to defeat the flesh, but we have to allow that to happen. And I'm telling you, many times we don't. Let me just give you a simple illustration. I know nobody's in here like this, but I like chocolate. I know some of y'all don't like chocolate. I like chocolate. Let's say you have 10 chocolate bars, okay? How many does your flesh want to eat? Yeah, it wants to eat them all at least. It wants to eat everything. If you put 3 Almond Joys in front of me after I've eaten lunch, you know what my flesh says? Hallelujah. I got 3 Almond Joys. But have you ever thought about this? That when you take that first bite of the Almond Joy, it's going to taste just like the rest of them. It's exactly the same. You know what your flesh is saying? That first bite doesn't satisfy. Really? Well, will the next one? No. Will the next one? No. There's a point where your body, your spiritual side says, enough. 3's enough. But you know how many really is enough? Just that first taste. That's all you really, even if, and you may not even need that. You see what I'm saying? Your flesh, it wants more and more, and it's never going to be satisfied. The only time that you put your flesh in its place is when you say, no, I'm not eating another donut. I've already had 6.5. Okay? Isn't that the truth? That's what you got to do. You eat one, you eat another, you eat another. There's a point where you have to say, I'm not doing it anymore. And I'm telling you, the point is either tell your body, no, you're not having any, or after 1 bite or 2 bites say, I've had enough. That. I'm telling you, it ain't going to get no better having 10 of them. They're all going to taste the same. Your flesh is telling you, I can't be satisfied. I know you can't be satisfied because it's an unbridled appetite. The Spirit of God helps us bridle that and tell it no. And I know that's a goofy illustration, but it's still the truth. Let me tell you, if you struggle with pornography and you watch something on the television, I guarantee you that first look at a lady is not going to satisfy your flesh. You know what your flesh is going to say? I need more. I need more. I need more. I heard James Dobson say this. When a person's looking at pornography, something happens in their brain, and he says it cannot ever be satisfied. They just want more and more and more and more. That's why, guys and ladies, the first image you have to say, enough. I'm not looking at any more of that. You have to stop it. It's the same way, guys. If you just get this, guys, your flesh is never going to stop attacking you. So you have to allow the Spirit of God to wage that battle and say, enough. I remember hearing a preacher say, when he got up in the morning, and I used to think, do you really do this? And maybe he did, I don't know. But he said that, I'll tell you later who it is. But he'd say this, I get up in the morning, I go in the bathroom, and he said, I look in that mirror and I say, now eyes, you're going to look at what I tell you to look at today. You're not looking at anything you want to, you're going to look at what I tell you to look at. Tongue, you're not going to say what you want to say, you're only going to say what I tell you to say. And he'd say, I'd put my hands up, and he'd say, hands, now you're only going to do what I'm going to do, and feet, you're only going to go where I tell you to go. And I used to think, do you really do that? But then I got to thinking, it'd be probably wise to do that. We sing that little song, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see." But once we're out of, kindergarten, we don't do that anymore. I'm just telling y'all, our flesh is weak, the consequences are horrible, and sin just keeps on trying. It just keeps on trying. And here it wrecked David's life. And it's sad. I mean, we'll read next week. We'll read chapter 12, and you'll see. What happens, but almost immediately after chapter 12, David's life just goes sad. It's a sad thing. Well, hey, I mentioned pray for me. I'm meeting with Tina's daughter tomorrow at the funeral home,